Today on Empowering Workplaces, we welcome Dr. Salvatore Falletta, professor for Human Resource Leadership and Organizational Science at Drexel University, inaugural research officer and board of directors member for Society for People Analytics, and best-selling author of Creepy Analytics, Avoid Crossing the Line and Establish Ethical HR Analytics for Smarter Workforce Decisions. Welcome to Empowering Workplaces, a show for anyone who wants to make work better and more fulfilling. We're your hosts, organizational psychologist Sonia Lucina
and aspiring leader Guille Santana. Join us in today's inspiring conversation.
Sal, we are beyond thrilled to have you on the podcast. We've been such huge admirers of your work. Your contribution to the people analytics and beyond community has been absolutely phenomenal. So we feel like, we're with royalty. Thank you so incredibly much for joining us today. I know we gave a little bit about your background, but we'd love for you to tell us more about who you are before we jump into the questions we have ready. So without further ado, welcome, Sal, and tell us a little more about yourself, please.
Sure thing, Sonia. Thank you so much, by the way, for inviting me to share and to this talk and on your podcast. I really greatly appreciate it. So a little bit about myself. I've had a long kind of background, and I would characterize my career kind of in three phases. There was, the 10 years or so you spend in graduate school, of course, torturing yourself. And then I spent about, I earned a doctoral degree in human resource development at North Carolina State University, did a lot of work in organizational psychology, statistics, research methods and evaluation, surveys and assessment, et cetera. Started my career in the private sector in the tech industry, doing everything from learning, measurement, and evaluation at Nortel Networks. And I even held a people analytics role. I was the head of global HR research and analytics at Intel, probably in the late 1990s, early 2000 time period, and had a wonderful opportunity to work at a number of high-tech companies, including SAP, Sun Microsystems, in a variety of HR roles. And I even served as a chief HR officer, if you can believe that. It really wasn't my cup of tea, to be honest. I'm more of a talent management, head of talent management, people analytics, HR strategy person. But I had to try it out, and it was a good learning experience for me. So before Drexel, I founded a small boutique employee survey firm. And we did human capital research, mostly employee surveys, workforce surveys for Fortune 500 companies, Fortune 1000 as well. And we were kind of like an educational advisory group. And that's how I met Vivek at Question Pro years back when we were looking for a kind of a back-end platform to use. And so I know your product and products well at Question Pro, by the way. And it's glad to see that Question Pro workforce is thriving, on a side note there. So on the topic of people analytics, I frequently present on the topic of HR analytics or people analytics, employee engagement, workforce surveys, talent management. Those, again, that's kind of my wheelhouse within the context of HR strategy. And then more recently, I just wrote the book, Creepy Analytics. That was kind of 25 years in the making, ever since my learning, measurement, and evaluation days in workforce and employee survey days back at Intel. So again, it was a long, it took a while to bake that book and get it right. So I'm very excited to be here and talk a little bit about the book and where I see the future, where we're going in terms of people analytics.
Well, I love that. Thank you for sharing your experience. I think, although I knew your background before you gave it, but even reliving it, it's really impressive to be able to come from such a perspective and such diverse experiences in different kinds of roles, different kinds of organizations. I think that really helps, especially individuals in all parts of their career, because all of us are working with our own finite set of experiences, right? And I think anyone who's obviously listening to this podcast is eager to learn more. And so then to be able to say, wow, for somebody that's so well established in this area and has had such diversified experience, pulling from different organizations, different approaches, different roles, that's incredibly valuable. So again, I'm like starstruck after you said that, even though I knew your CV before. But thank you so much for giving us more color commentary, and thank you so much for being a fan of Question Pro. That I know has always meant so much to both Vivek and me and the team. And that's
you're quite welcome. Yeah, Vivek and I go way back, admittedly. And so yeah, I'm really glad to be here. And and I could give some context. I've seen how people analytics has evolved, like from before it was called people analytics to people analytics 1.0 all the way to 3.0 and beyond. So I'm able to give that kind of context. I think that'll be really useful for your viewers.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember, like, we were chatting, when I think I was living in London at the time. Maybe was that 2013? It was still like a little bit early. And I think that's when the People Analytics brand started to come out. So definitely a lot of history.
Yeah, absolutely.
I love that. So, Dr. Sal, to go straight to the point, the name of your book is called Creepy Analytics. Can you tell us a little bit about how organizations can balance the benefits of analytics without crossing that quote unquote creepy line?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, to be honest, that's going to be a tough one to answer in one mouthful, because, I think, or in one shot, but I think it'll become clear by the end of our talk, right? But let me start with this. As Sanjay alluded to, we have a robust people analytics community today. It's been around 2013, 2014 is when we started seeing a lot of articles. And although I would argue that people analytics has a long and rich history that spans 100 years, because given my background as a social, behavioral, and organizational scientist, and when you consider all of the HR research and measurement activities and the contributions from other social, behavioral, and organizational scientists who paved the way long ago. I mean, for decades, there was people like Douglas Frey, an IO psychologist, doing this work in AT&T back in 1954. And I'm not kidding. That's so true. And then IBM was doing it throughout probably the late 60s, 70s, still doing amazing work. And this is all before the people analytics moniker kind of came into vogue. Around the last decade or so, though, we've been seeing a lot of published books and resources and conferences on the topic of HR analytics. It's also referred to, as popularly referred to as people analytics, talent analytics, human capital analytics, workforce analytics. Although, I would argue there's some nuanced distinctions between those labels. And I use HR analytics for several principled reasons, one being I really believe it should reside in HR and not necessarily in the business intelligence function. Not everybody shares that view, and a lot of top companies in the Fortune 100 have it outside of the HR function, or it's being led by a business intelligence individual. So I prefer it to be squarely residing in HR function, reporting directly to the head of HR. Those are hard to find. Typically you'll find people analytics embedded deep in the bowels of the HR operations and technology function, because people think of it as inextricably linked with their digital HR stacks, right? So as I mentioned, there's tons of resources out there, and a lot of good intentions, across the people analytics community. But over the years, I've seen kind of this gradual erosion of, workplace privacy and ethics, this coupled with this kind of this datafication, if you will. I refer to that as the quantified employee agenda, and it's running amok a little bit. And this kind of stuff that I'll share a little later in their talk, it undermines the potential benefits, right, to organizations and to employees, right? And so many of my colleagues in the HR or people analytics community will say, big data doesn't mean big brother, Sal, and that's true. But numerous workplace technologies, practices, and stories have made front page news. They're dubious at best. And so I want to be fair about this. So one thing to consider is people analytics, HR analytics means different things to different people, right? For some, it's just simple HR, descriptive metrics and reporting, maybe with the power to predict. And for others, it's sophisticated predictive modeling, organizational behavior research studies, including workforce surveys, employee surveys, engagement surveys, all of that. And, so I think my concern that I have is in my view, there's too much focus on what can be done rather than what should be done. So I want to add a little to that, if I could, around ethics, right? So, ethics is one of those, it's the gray area, right? It's a very gray area. And we all know that ethics is not the same thing as legal, right? And one big challenge is the meaning of ethics itself, right? So ethics means different things to different people. For, when you consider, ethics for an academic, they may look at that as a branch of philosophy that deals with moral principles and values, right, wrong, good, bad, yada, 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 right? And so, but ethics can mean different things, different people. As I mentioned, it can vary depending on the context and people involved. So, for example, business leaders, particularly in the C-suite, they're bound by regulatory obligations, right? They have fiduciary responsibility to drive shareholder value and strategic competitive advantage and profit for their shareholders. That's their business and ethical imperative, right? So, so on the other hand, an academic like me and other ethicists will view it through the lens of moral philosophy and theorize about what people should do without any practical constraints. So I'm trying to be fair here. So to unpack that a little more, so say you're a CEO or someone in the C-suite, they've already decided they're going to implement a particular people analytics practice, or they're going to adopt some specific AI-powered platform because they believe it's going to lead to strategic competitive advantage and other business outcomes, right? So from that perspective, ethics is kind of a moot point. It's a total moot point, right? Because the discussion is not about whether we're going to adopt it or whether we're going to do it. They're going to do it. They're not going to do it, right? And so it largely then becomes centered around what organizations can do or not do legally in terms of compliance, and also about mitigating risk. In other words, how do we put guardrails around our people analytics practices? Another related area to ethics is today, HR analytics, people analytics is a team sport. All right. So in the old days, it was social and behavioral and organizational scientists like us doing this work. Not anymore. Today we got business intelligence professionals, data scientists, mathematicians, computer scientists, behavioral economists. Oh, the list goes on. And I'm not convinced all of those professionals receive the same amount of training in ethics, right, as social, behavioral, and organizational sciences. They might, maybe. But I don't think a data scientist gets the same level of ethical training as a psychologist, and that's bias, I suppose, my lens, right? So we know it's all about the gray area, and the one last thing before we move on to the next area, I think, I want to mention that what I hear a lot of my colleagues saying is they go, hey, Sal, the genie's already out of the bottle. The genie is out. And so all the ethics in the world, all the ethics charter, all the data governance and transparency policies are not nearly enough. And it's probably going to take country-specific legislation to sort it all out. However, I do believe in the meantime that the people analytics community needs to be proactive and adopt an ethical approach to one building out their people analytics capabilities, by establishing some sort of ethical system, ethical ecosystem, if you will, throughout their HR analytics journey.
Yeah. No, thank you for that. And I agree. It's such a sensitive area, and it's not black and white always, and it is subject to interpretation, but it's got to be given thought. And it can't, no matter who's working on projects with different backgrounds, I think the conversation of making sure that at least the team is on the same page is crucial, because it's not things you want to find out later. And it's not, as somebody, who deeply cares about the, the workforce, you don't want to be caught in a place where you're like, wait a minute, I was doing this with best intentions, and all of a sudden it got a mind of its own, and I'm not only not proud of my work anymore, but I'm actually quite terrified about where this can go. So I think, thank you for all those important conversations. And it's hard. And like, these problems are not always black and white. That's what makes them challenging, right? If there was a guidebook of everyone does exactly X, Y, Z, we wouldn't be having this conversation. But I think that's what makes this conversation even more important. And so that actually leads to our next question. You talk about a proven 7-step process or the HR analytics cycle for studying and scaling evidence-based HR analytics capabilities. So for somebody who's listening, that's maybe now working in Fortune 100 or now working in organizations where this is really, there's a path already set out and maybe they're just plugging into an already well-oiled machine, I think this is going to be particularly useful, even for those organizations, because I think sometimes it's really important to look at some challenges in a different kind of way. But what is your 7-step process?
Yeah, so in my book, Creepy Analytics, I introduce this 7-step HR analytics cycle, right? And it's meant to be a practical framework for building evidence-based and ethical HR analytics capabilities, right? And this is typically, you always see this in the large companies where big Fortune 100s, but this could be applicable for small companies just starting out, just thinking about building out some people analytics capabilities where they would start small and kind of build out the capabilities over time. So it's applicable for a wide range of organizations, regardless of sector or industry. And it's a 7-step process. So the first step is an obvious one. It's all about determining stakeholder requirements, right? And these could be strategic requirements, strategic projects that the C-suite and the head of HR and other HR COE leaders have in mind, or it could be tactical kind of issues that they're trying to deal with, to give them data and insights to enable decision-making, right, as quickly as possible. The model itself, the 7-step process, it's really meant to be a strategic framework that you would use once a year to establish your people analytics or HR analytics agenda. So that's the first step, to meet with stakeholders, partner with them, don't ignore them, but at the same time, don't let stakeholders hijack the entire HR research agenda. And that can happen easily when you have powerful stakeholders that insert themselves in these discussions, right, along with the head of HR. So the second step is, once you know the high-level stakeholder requirements in step one, the second step is defining the HR research and analytics agenda. Now, you notice I say HR research and analytics, right? It's not all about mining and modeling a bunch of noise and nonsense, right? A bunch of internal data or external data in the ether out there where you're looking for trends and patterns. That's a correlational fishing expedition. And it has a lot of value, by the way. That's a bottom-up, data-driven approach. But I also think organizations should be doing active research and experimentation too, including employee surveys, org behavior studies. They shouldn't be just mining and modeling data and go, oh, look at the patterns here. Because if the data is big enough, you'll see relationships everywhere. And some of them may be, well, ridiculous, right? And problematic. Again, you can end up with spurious correlations. And so it's important to establish a research agenda that's both short-term and long-term. And you want to make sure you have a balanced research agenda, that it's not just, doing the cool and sexy work and AI, that sometimes it involves manually, manual data collection, or you're using web-based surveys and things like that, and where you're doing hypotheses, theory-driven type of research, right, as well as bottom-up, data-driven data mining and modeling, right? So it's important to know that, and that's really gets into the third step and the fourth step. The third step is identifying your data sources. So data sources can be traditional, employee surveys, HR metrics, data in your HRIS system, right? Or they could be novel. Novel data sources is that digital exhaust out there in social media, right? And as long as it's nothing wrong with using novel data sources that are outside of the organization. However, do it ethically and responsibly. And then data sources could be public or private. And then when you get to step 4, that's just gathering the data. And data could be gathered in a primary way or a secondary way, right? And it could be active or passive. So today it's really cool to do passive data gathering on novel data sources that are unstructured, but there's nothing wrong with continuing to do good old-fashioned traditional data sources like an employee survey, and doing it in an active way where it's totally transparent to the employee, rather than doing this, covert kind of analysis out there. So, and
I will pause there, interrupt you for a second, and ask our listeners to please rewind and listen to Sal again to what he just said in point 4. And I joke, but I don't, because also, I mean, clearly I'm, head of Question Pro Employee Listening. It's, employee experience surveys are what I believe in. It's what I chose to do with focus my career on right now. And it's interesting how many conversations I'm in where people are like, oh, surveys are dead, passive data. I'm like, listen, people, there's a place for everything. Just because there's some new source doesn't mean that something tried and proven and it can give us so much value is now obsolete. And I think, a lot of, and I'm guessing some people maybe believe that. I'm guessing probably 99% of people who are saying that are also looking to be more controversial. But every time I kid you not, I'm like, wait a minute. Like if I'm in a webinar, in a conversation, I'm like, hold, we need to dig in. So anyways, I'll let you go on with step 5, but I just wanted to reiterate to our audience that Sal mentioned that both are good.
We're going to come back to that when we talk a little bit about some of the creepy analytics practices with respect to the, you got traditional employee surveys like you mentioned, and I love doing those. And then there's also employee listening and sensing systems that are out there. And then that gets right at the crux of the argument. I think there's a benefit to advantages and disadvantages to both of those, right? Yeah. And I think you should be doing them both, really, for different purposes and different reasons. So yeah, let me wrap up the model, and we're going to get back to that though, because that is one of my pet peeves too. So the fifth step is obvious. You analyze the data, or you transform it, particularly if you have multiple disparate data sources and you're using, a data aggregator or technology. There's a lot of good companies out there that have data aggregation. One Model's one, but there's others out there that can aggregate data from disparate data sources so you can make sense of it in relation to each other. Or you may just be analyzing survey data from a web-based employee engagement survey or an org behavior research study. The 6th step is all about communicating your results, right? Your insights. And then more importantly, it shouldn't just stop at communicating and storytelling. It should enable strategy and decision making. That is HR strategy that's aligned to the business strategy, but as well as, day-to-day talent or workforce decision making, right? So yeah, to your point, that's gonna dovetail in to the next area, I think. But I think there's advantages and disadvantages with traditional active data gathering versus novel data sources that are gathered in a passive, invisible way. So, yeah.
Wow. Now I'm super curious. Can you share examples of how HR analytics has been misused in companies, and obviously what lessons can we learn from them?
Yeah, so it's really important. I'm going to add this caveat right here, but it's important to keep in mind that ethics means different things to different people, right? Yes. And even among the people analytics professionals, right? Even the community itself. I'm not talking about C-suite execs. It depends if they have a mathematics or data science maybe, or background or business intelligence background versus social, behavioral, and organizational scientists, right? So I'm not gonna get on my soapbox and say that it's the social, behavioral, and org scientists that are the paragons of all things ethics, right? Not, and that means everybody else is unethical. No, and that's not true at all. I know a lot of ethical data scientists out there that have been trained in it. But I do think, and as I mentioned earlier, it's very much a team sport. So ethics is going to mean things to different people. So whether a specific HR analytics practice that I'm going to share is considered creepy is going to depend on your personal and professional values at the end of the day, and the risk your organization is willing to take when it comes to ethical shades of gray, right? So again, some of these that I'm going to share, they range from dubious to or questionable to downright creepy, and it really depends on you. So let's start. So let's think about it from this perspective. There's people analytics work today is much broader than doing surveys and research work and metrics like we did in the past. A big trend now is the datafication of various factors and variables, right? And that means mining and modeling a whole host of data out there. So what I've seen out there, they're kind of strange, and they've been around for over a decade, maybe longer. One is the datafication of frivolous factors, meaning you're analyzing, mining and modeling data that on at least when you look at it at face value, looks nonsensical. So for example, some companies, I won't mention who, but in the past, some big companies, they designed these customized surveys that will ask people questions about their pet preferences or their hometown or magazines you subscribe to. What's your favorite ice cream flavor or your favorite color? And they know through big data analytics, that it correlates maybe with their personality, or it's going to help them predict future job performance. And so what these are, they're considered proxy variables or measures. They totally lack transparency, but that's by design because they don't want clever psychopaths, right, to be able to game the test. So if you want to measure someone's personality, I always say, hey, just give someone a good old-fashioned personality test like Hogan, the Big Five personality assessment, etc. It's transparent. They know what they're doing. But there are some crazy people, and and you want to weed out the psychopaths and misfits. You don't necessarily want them working for your company. So companies, what they'll do is they'll come up with these clever proxy measures to kind of get at certain things indirectly. So for example, they found that several companies, large ones, have done this in the past. They learned that hometown is a relatively good predictor for attrition. So think about for a second. So if you're from New York City or San Francisco in the Bay Area or Silicon Valley or Chicago or Atlanta, hey man, the world of work is my career oyster and I can move from company to company. I have all these options. Right. And so if you're born and raised in an urban jungle, you probably, over time, you probably have the attitude that, I'm the master of my career and I can do whatever I want and move from company to company. Whereas if you're from a little small town in the middle of a farming town in Iowa or Illinois somewhere, you might think twice about leaving that company where if you're hometown, small rural area, right? You might think twice. So they know that people from big cities, big hubs are, 10 times more likely to leave a company than someone from a small town. Now, all else being equal, right? Obviously, if you have a miserable boss, even the person from the small town may leave in a trip, right, from a company. But they know that hometown is a good proxy and predictor of attrition. So I always joke and say, well, I suppose the thinking is that people from small towns, so think about that with pet preferences. So they also know that dog lovers are more likely to stay with a company than cat people. Now think about that. Kind of makes sense. Dogs are more loyal. Cats are independent and aloof. All right. So, but the question is, should you be using that kind of data and information to make, talent decisions? I suppose if everything else is equal, you got candidate checks all the boxes. Maybe we go with the dog person that's from a small town rather than someone that was from a big city that has a cat. So I suppose the thinking may be that if you're from a small town who loves dogs, are more loyal than cat enthusiasts from the urban jungle, I don't know if we should be making workforce decisions like that on frivolous factors. But that's one that really annoys me. There's a whole bunch of others that I won't go into as much detail with. One though, however, this was in the New York Times, health risk monitoring and nudging. So with HIPAA, you're not supposed to be really monitoring health risk, people's medical records and like, hey, you shouldn't be doing that as a company. Now your insurance provider may do it. That's why they have wellness portals. Those are spooky. Trust me. There's a reason why the health insurance companies give a corporation a discount if you get your employees to use the wellness portal. A wellness portal, don't forget, it's a data collection mechanism. It's for the big and health insurance companies to collect data on your drinking habits, your smoke. So if they know 40% of your workforce smokes and 80% of them drink, they might use that against you in future negotiations, even if you're self-funded. So be careful with that. But there have been companies that got caught using third-party vendors to monitor health risks of employees, right? And then you might weigh that information when you're doing a big layoff, a big reduction in force. Ooh, well, this, it's kind of like, so think about it. You can't discriminate by certain, you have to do adverse impact analysis. You can't discriminate by age and gender and ethnicity and things, and religiosity, et cetera. Even not only in hiring, but also when you do a reduction in force activity, you have to make sure there's no adverse impact analysis. So that monitoring health risk has implications. I'm not sure how they're doing it legally, but it was in a Wall Street Journal article, and they published that. It was really interesting. They got caught using the third party. Another annoying thing that companies like to do, particularly with AI-powered tools and technologies, is behavior shaping and nudging. So the whole nudge theory, give people nudges. All right. Yeah, I mean, I guess it has some utility and it could be useful in certain contexts. I don't know about you, though. Maybe it's a generational thing for me, but I wouldn't want to be incessantly nudged, constantly reminded. I turn that functionality off in a nanosecond. That's me, though. Another interesting article I read was some big pharmaceutical companies, not mentioning any names. They monitor non-executive employees that dump their stock. Now, SEC has requirements for the C-suite. So if a C-suite executive is selling a big chunk of stock, that has to be identified and reported, right? But not non-executive employees. So if they're dumping or selling out their stock options, to me, that's no different than managing your 401k portfolio or any other financial transaction. And the company should not be using that as an indicator of imminent attrition or disloyalty. But this company, and I heard it from, I was at a conference and this individual shared that their company does that. And I was shocked. And they proudly do it. They monitor non-executive employees who dump their stock as an indicator of disloyalty and potential attrition. Other creepy practices include private data obtained from social media sites. You've heard this. There's a little company out there that watches your LinkedIn, and if you change your tagline, it indicates that, hey, Billy or Susie may be thinking about leaving the company because they're changing their tagline. And so it's a third-party vendor, right, that does this, and you can get the subscription with them. Your HR function can do that. And they monitor your employees' LinkedIn accounts on the public side, which is legal, right? So, hey, Sal changed his tagline. He tweaked his titles a little bit, and it's like a 60% probability he's going to leave the company. I don't know about you, but if I found that my employer was using that tool, I would change my tagline in LinkedIn every week just to torture them, to torment my employer. That way you keep them off balance and they never know when you're going to leave. You just do it weekly. And there were some people that were upset for me. I wrote that in my book, by the way. They were upset with me for sharing that, telling employees to do that. But if you know your employer is using them and you don't want them to know when or if, I would do it frequently just to keep them, in check. I just think that's a little weird, and my job. So the question is, all right, that's true. Then you would say that's a good, some employees and the people analytics. Well, some of my colleagues in the people analytics analytics community would say, Sal, that's a good thing though, because then managers can have a stay conversation with people. Yeah, okay. But a clever employee may say, oh, a stay conversation? Well, here's my list of demands. I want advancement, promotion pronto, a big salary, pay increase. I want to work remotely, no questions asked. You know what I mean? So if you're going to have that stay conversation, assuming they're a high potential and you want to keep that employee, you better be prepared for that stay conversation, right? Particularly if you're using a platform service that's monitoring LinkedIn changes.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, what's interesting is in a lot of these examples that you're giving, a lot is tied to technology, right? And we're seeing more technological advance, like, right, it's something that's going to continue to escalate. So what do you see? How do you see the future of HR analytics evolving in the light of, because again, like a lot of what you mentioned, like, is evolution of technologies and the ability to grab this information, it's maybe questionable at best. Like, what do you see over the next even just couple of years? Because I think maybe it's really hard to predict that far out at this point. But like, what should organizations or people be looking out for or prepare?
Yeah, you want to be careful. I mean, there's all kinds of workforce surveillance tools and technologies out there. One that I picked on a little bit in my book, and again, I did extensive research on this topic, is this area of video interviewing technology that employs voice analysis and profiling and micro expression analysis, which is a lot like phrenology to me, where they're measuring people's skulls, but I'm joking a little bit. There is a science to it, but it's still an emerging science. So what these tools do, there's some video interviewing technologies out there that are used to to enable hiring decisions. At the end of the day, people make the decision. But I don't particularly like them. I actually went through one and I wasn't happy about it. I knew what it was. I knew it was it was looking for, my micro expression analysis, probably trying to detect deception. Watching if my eye goes up a little higher here, or my cheek, or a smirk. So I knew what the tool was doing. I got so frustrated, and I shared this in my book. What I ended up doing was I teased the tool. I was making sarcastic remarks. I knew then I didn't want the job. Once, just by because I had to go through that process, and this was for the head of people analytics at a huge company. Big, high-paying job, probably reports almost directly to the head of HR and one level below. And I just said, the first thing I'm going to do if I get this job is get rid of this. But that's me, and not everybody shares that. Some companies and people analytics professionals swear by it. I still think the science is emerging. There's a lot of AI snake oil out there, and you got to be careful. So the EEOC and other advocacy groups are investigating and looking into these AI-powered selection tools that do automated decision systems, they're called. So you got to be careful. But to answer your question specifically, there are all kinds of technological trends and transformations, right? And it's really exciting for the people analytics community. But if I have to be frank, really frank, and I think I'm a pretty frank person. I tell you what's on my mind. No hidden agenda here. But based on my experience at several Fortune level companies, as a former head of people analytics, former head of HR, and my background, social behavioral and organizational science, I got a pretty good understanding of human nature. So I'm not an eternal optimist. I'm teasing you a little bit, but I'm cautious.
I got that little dig.
I saw that. I was in your LinkedIn. No, but I love it. I'm not an eternal optimist, but I am cautiously optimistic for the future. So, as alluded to earlier, organizations, they're analyzing structured and unstructured data, novel and traditional data. But I'd be careful with this. Unstructured and novel data sources are in vogue today, but they lack a lot of transparency, and they could potentially creep out your workforce. There's all kinds of tools and toys out there, and you can't blame leaders, really. If you think about it, if you're a C-suite exec and the head of HR and even the head of people analytics, or digital HR technology, right? You're always looking for new and emerging ways to streamline and accelerate analytical insights and making critical workforce decisions, right? That's strategic competitive advantage. But you got to ask yourself, how much strategic competitive advantage can we hope to achieve if we adopt this tool or toy, or if we adopt a particular people analytics practice, right? So it could become creepy. And I think the people analytics community is at an ethical crossroad, right? We really are. We're at a crossroad, and I believe that the choices we make now will determine whether or not a quantified employee agenda really exists, right? So the question is, are we going to become something unrecognizable, dark, and dystopian, or are we going to continue to be a positive force for good, like many of my good colleagues share to me? I think we can, but if you think about the crossroad we're at, I think most organizations will take the evidence-based and ethical path. I do think some organizations will get right up to the creepy line, right up to it, push the envelope. And we may have a few select organizations that may consciously or perhaps unconsciously cross the line and go into that scary quantified employee agenda, right? So, yeah, I'm hopeful. I'm cautiously optimistic, but my experience shows the more AI technologies emerge and the more we start becoming more technologically enabled with people analytics, the temptation it'll be too great, I think, for some executives and people analytics leaders to ignore. But I'm hopeful. We'll choose the right path.
Yeah, well, and I think that's a great place to be, because I think to give up now or to be really scared is not as productive. To be hopeful, but also cautious, I think is the right place to be. And then to continue to idea share and educate our community like we are through the conversation today, I think is the best that we can do, and to share knowledge and to share, what has worked, what hasn't, any cautions. I think it'll help us advance, because we have to advance and we have to experiment. We just need to find as a community the best, most ethical way to experiment with different things to help ourselves advance without sliding into those dangerous areas. All right. Last words of advice. I feel like even after reading your book and having known you and followed you, took so many notes. So I don't know if there is anything else that you can think of you'd want to share with our audience, but I wanted to just open up this space in case there was something that we haven't discussed yet in our conversations. Any advice?
If you want a lot of details, I encourage people obviously to check out the book. But I have a lot of presentations that are already out here. But I'll share a lot with you right here. I think that your viewers will appreciate. So one thing, I think we need to have some open and honest discussion, dialogue, and debate about the perils and paradoxes of people analytics, not just the promise and the potential. So everybody's talking about what's possible and everything that's exciting, but nobody really wants to talk about, how we can get ourselves in a real pickle. We have a lot of optimists out there, not enough pessimists in my view. And I just think we need a few. You don't want 90% pessimists. You want 90% optimists. You want about 7 to 8% pessimists that keep people honest, that are out there.
Well, I think we have them. They might not put it on their LinkedIn profile.
They may not put it on their LinkedIn profile. Yeah. And then we have some, unfortunately, I think we have some creepy realists out there that are going to do whatever they got to do to get competitive advantage, even if it means crossing the line once in a while. But another thing we need to do, so number one, have an open and honest dialogue and conversation about this. Number two, we need to articulate the value and benefits to people, not just the organization. It's easy to talk about competitive advantage and streamlining and all these wonderful things we can do, but how does it benefit an employee? I mean, if you think about it, incessantly nudging me with some AI platform, that's hardly an employee value proposition. would drive someone crazy maybe with that, right? I don't know. And so you should know I'm a friend, and I'm not a foe of HR. I'm a friend. I'm an ally to HR and the people analytics community. I've been doing this work for years. One thing I want to mention, though, that's in the book. So when you have the 7-step HR analytics cycle that we talked about, each step has an ethical outcome associated with it. Step 1 is all about ethical expectations, managing expectations, right? So if you have a C-suite executive going off the rails, wanting to adopt some creepy tool, you got to have a conversation. Hopefully you do that up front, where it's not after the fact. Step 2, it's all about ethical questions and hypotheses. You want to manage that. Step 3, it's all about ensuring your data sources are ethical, that you're not doing it in a creepy way, right? Yeah. And this gets into, the types of tools and technologies you procure. You consider the legal and ethical implications, all of that. Ask yourself, like I said before, how much competitive advantage are we really going to get if we adopt this? And what happens if we don't? Are we really going to fall behind our competitors? I don't know. You got to think about that. I also, when getting technologies and tools, consider going with white box AI. Avoid the black box, mysterious black box AI. It's better to go with glass box and white box AI, which is more transparent and correctable. In terms of data gathering, you want to make sure your methods are ethical. In terms of analysis, that's step 5. You want to ensure your analysis is ethical and your interpretation is ethical, right? That is so important. Step 6, this is a big one. You want to make sure you engage in ethical insights and storytelling, right? When you communicate your insights. What happens, this is the biggest, I think one of the biggest challenges for people analytics leaders, is to getting executives, right? Working with executives to avoid cherry picking the data and insights that only supports the powerful stakeholders' preconceived agenda or decision or strategy that they have in their, the back of their mind. So the cherry picking is horrible. And they do it with employee surveys too, by the way, where when they're action planning, they'll cherry pick data and insights and sometimes go after the low hanging fruit and ignore the most pressing problems. So the story we tell, storytelling is powerful, but the veracity of the story matters, right? And storytelling, in my view, shouldn't be code for telling executives what they want to hear. And then lastly, step 7 is about ethical use and decisions, right? Most books, textbooks out there, and most consultants will say, oh, once you communicate the insights and do the storytelling, you're done. Wipe your hands clean. The executives run into the room and they start formulating non-evidence-based solutions and strategies and practices. Yikes. What you want is to ensure that as a people analytics leader, the leader in particular, at least has a seat at the table, reporting to the head of HR ideally, where they're influencing all of the COEs across the entire HR function to enable the broader HR strategy, workforce strategy, right? As well as any decision making. Because what typically happens is they'll collect that data, they'll cherry pick the data and insights, run into a room and only use the insights to support their agenda. And then the people analytics leader is completely out of the equation at that point. So these are important, I think, tips for each step when you consider the ethical outcomes of the HR analytics cycle. So,
well, thank you. I think they're very important and also very practical. And I think few of our listeners would listen and disagree. I think it's just making sure that, write it on a Post-it, stick it on your desk or on a piece of paper, make sure you continue to remind yourself, because sometimes it's like something will happen around you even before you notice. You're like, wait a minute, where did these people go? No, hold on. Don't use that data that way. That's not what I meant.
It's true though. To be honest though, and it's easier said than done. I was a head of people analytics, HR research and analytics, and I struggled with that with employee surveys, with action planning, in the back end, with cherry picking, telling executives what they want to hear, because it's people analytics and employee survey work, or workforce survey work. It's highly political, right? right down to the questions you ask, the practices you engage in, the data and the insights and how it's used. It is a political process. No one wants to talk about that elephant in the room, but you got to be a strong leader and a good leader. And it's all about building relationships and having influence. And you can't always demand it. It's a lot easier when the head of people analytics reports directly to the head of HR, because then they could serve the HR function equally. Yeah. Rather than if it's in technology and operations, you're only going to chase AI tools and toys, right? If it's in learning, measurement, and evaluation, you're probably going to do learning measurement till the cows come home. If you're in OD, you're going to do OD surveys or workforce surveys. I believe you want to be as high as possible, so that people analytics, HR analytics, is inextricably linked to HR strategy. And it really needs to be a standalone COE, ideally, reporting to the head of HR. Now, I've had some good colleagues disagree with me on that for various reasons. But I think that's if you got an opportunity, if you're a senior person at the VP director level and you're reporting to the head of HR, or at least to the head of talent management, I think you're in a good place in terms of positioning, because then you could serve HR equally. You get what I mean? If you're in comp and ben, what are you going to do? You'll be looking at benefits, conjoint analysis for benefits forever. Yeah. Like you tend to take on the flavor of the COE you're embedded in. And that's why I always emphasize that it needs to be up, connected to strategy, ideally to the reporting to the head of HR. Yeah.
Well, Sal, we can't thank you enough for everything today. I feel like we learned so much, and I'm so excited for our listeners to be able to take in all of your knowledge and all of your wisdom. Please, everybody, if you haven't bought Sal's book yet, again, it's called Creepy Analytics, Avoid Crossing the Line and Establish Ethical HR Analytics for Smarter Workforce Decisions. I'm sure it's available on Amazon, I know as a fact. I'm sure it's available in any popular,
it's probably backwards, right? It looks like it's backwards on the screen, but it's my life's work, and I think it's a practical how-to guide. It doesn't get into the details of like data science analysis, but if you want to build your function, your capability, whether you're a big company or a small company just starting out, this will be an excellent resource. And there's a lot of other excellent books out there too in the marketplace. Thank you so much, Sonia.
Oh, thank you. And so one last question for anyone that would like to get in touch with you or follow your work more closely, where's the best place?
Oh, you could just connect with me by via email. That's sf394@drexel.edu.
Wonderful. Thanks so much again, Sal.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your time, and I really appreciate the opportunity to share here on your podcast. Take care.
Take care. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. See you again soon. Bye.